All right, good morning. Thank you for joining me this morning to talk about getting ready for the PAT. My name is Maria Sousa. I am the secondary science consultant, and let's get started. So before we do get started, I do want to take a minute to acknowledge the land that we're gathered on here this morning. The Creator gifted us with this land that we are blessed to share and care for together. The Calgary Catholic School District acknowledges that the land we gather on, Okinstis, is the ancestral territory of the Siksika, the Siksika, the Kainai, Piikani, and Amskapi Piikani. We acknowledge all First Nations and Métis of Treaty 7 lands, the Tsuut'ina, the Ithaqabay, which includes Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Goodstoney. The Calgary Catholic School District commits to advancing reconciliation, guided by truths, respecting treaty laws, and humbly walking alongside First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. We recognize all who live, work, and play on these lands, and who now call this place home. So today's the feast day of St. Catherine of Siena. So rather than do a prayer, I do like to kind of reach into our rich church history. She was a doctor of the church. She heavily influenced Italian literature. She's a patron saint against fires, nurses, of sick people, and so many other things. So just to remind us, everything we do is anchored in our priorities. So today, and so as you see, these are our 4 priorities. And today our talk is really focused on student success, really supporting student learning needs and creating optimal student-centered learning and assessment practices. So today, I do want to talk about getting ready, so student preparedness, a little bit of information about the test itself, understanding the test, and the students' skills that are required for the students to be successful on the science PAT. So where to start? We got to start with preparedness. I included here a document on sort of mental preparedness. I know kids, for some of them, might be the first time they take a really big test. I know they've been practicing throughout the year, but this PDF, it just has some strategies, like some breathing exercises you might want to or consider doing with your students to help them feel more calm before they start the test. So, there's always, and there's just some good ideas and maybe some tips to share with your students before the actual test and in getting ready for the test. And then I think it's important to talk about the physical preparedness. So thinking about where the students will be, just kind of running them through that, telling them to have breakfast, all those things, and, making sure that they know the rules for the test, like no cell phones, having a calculator, having their pencils, those kinds of things. Just the better prepared they are, hopefully, the more confident they'll feel about their test. Okay. Now I can't get it back to, there it goes. So, so just a little bit about the test itself. I always recommend checking out the general bulletin. It just provides overarching information about PATs in Alberta and some key points. Specific to the science PAT is the general bulletin for science. It kind of talks about skills students require, what the trends that we've been seeing in Alberta over the last few years, what excellence looks like versus just achieving just a passing grade. So just determining the different skill levels. And then the PAT this year will be Thursday, June 19th. It's scheduled for 75 minutes, but students do have extra time, so they have double time. So my question is, when you are doing tests in your classrooms, do students have some experience with a timed assessment? I'd imagine that they do by grade 9, but I think it's really important to be mindful of continuing to do that, especially as we go in through the next 2 months. And the last thing is, have you had a chance to practice with Veretta? I will talk a little bit about Veretta later on in the talk. But I think it's important to have the kids just practice logging in, getting in on the lockdown browser and that kind of stuff, just to not be overwhelmed that morning of the PAT. Now, I have to admit, it's kind of nice to have science at the last, because by the time they get to science, they'll have probably logged in 3 or 4 times. So they'll be a little more comfortable with it. Okay, so the PAT itself, the blueprint of it is this. So one thing I do want to bring your attention to is the weightings, and they're all equally weighted. This is something that's important to remember, which means I know that some skills in some of the different units might be newer to the students, therefore you do end up spending more time on them, which makes sense. But I think it's important to recognize that when it comes down to it, each topic is represented equally on the PAT, which then means we do really have to cover the entire curriculum, and we have to give each unit a fair amount of time, or a fair shake, if you will, in order to make sure that the kids have been exposed to the content and the skills required to access that content. So knowledge and skills questions. The PAT divides the questions, of course, into each unit, but I'm going to go back to the other slide for a second. And you can see that each of the topics is divided into 2 kinds or 2 types of questions: knowledge-based questions and skill-based questions. And you can see that for the PAT, 60% of the exam is actually skill-based. They're not straight knowledge questions. They're not memorizing questions. They are take the knowledge that the kids have gained throughout the year and apply it using the skills that they have learned throughout the year. So what's the difference? This comes right out of the general bulletin that Alberta Ed provides for science. So the knowledge components are just looking at the fundamental understanding of the concept and some of the processes. So they really kind of fall under that remember and recall type of question. Whereas the skill questions, the skill components relate to the application of the science process and using higher level thinking to solve a problem. So there are apply and infer type of questions. So why don't we take a look practically what the difference between these 2 types of questions are. Anyway, I'll pop down to this one later. So when we look at knowledge and skills questions, they can be easy and they can be difficult. And so the way we determine if a question is easy or difficult is looking at the statistics, and Alberta Ed publishes the percentage of students who got something correct. So the lower that number is, the more difficult the question is. So let's take a look at an easy knowledge question. So I'm looking at the 2017 released PAT, and if you look at a question like this, it's a straight knowledge question. They're asking the student, really, what is a niche? Probably you've done this many times. And we find that this first unit, biological diversity, tends to be a unit the students do very well on. And you can see there's, it's a very straightforward question that many students will find very easy to do. And here's a skills question. So it looks scary, but it's not, because it asks a really straightforward question. What's the best, which graph best represents the data? But the reason it's a skills question is because the student has to read a graph. Okay, in fact, it has to read 2 types of graphs. They have to look at these arrays and then have to think about, well, what's happening to the arrays on a line graph. Here's a difficult knowledge question. The reason I think this type of knowledge question is more difficult is because this is a very new concept for students, right? This is the first time they're really looking at chemicals and using the periodic table in sort of a concrete way. And so if they haven't practiced using the periodic table and really thought about what these chemicals are, it becomes a difficult question. And then if you look, here is a difficult skills question. So what makes this difficult? Well, arguably it's because it's the electrical principles unit, and this is a heavy skills unit. It's a very new concept. It's using electricity. It's just really new for students. And then we give them these diagrams, these schematics to try and describe a process or a situation, and it gets hard. So in addition to having to take a look at the schematic diagram, for a student to get 1 point, they have to get all 4 variables correct that are presented in a table. This is just a wickedly difficult question. All right, so maybe what I'll do is I'll just give you guys a second, and you guys can take a look at these 2 types, multiple choice 7 and 8 and multiple choice 12 and 13, and we can decide, are they skills questions, are they knowledge questions, are they easy, are they difficult? So looking at multiple choice 7 and 8, both questions are indeed knowledge questions, and the first one is a easy knowledge question and the second one is a difficult knowledge question. Now, given that there's just a text, these both questions just have text, what makes this challenging to some of our EAL learners is there's no clues, right? There's no visual cue to help the student figure out what is maybe being talked about. So typically, most students in Alberta did quite well on question 7 and not as well on question 8. But I don't know what the EAL data would have shown, but I guess from your experience, you might be able to have a better understanding of how the EAL students might perform on these. If you look at that first question, it's really just a definitions question, question 7, and question 8 is, although it's a knowledge question, it's just presented in a more unique way where the student has to, they do have to kind of have a deeper understanding of like what abundance is and diversity in the same kind of question. So they're kind of holding 2 ideas in their mind at the same time. If we look at multiple choice 12 and 13, these are both skills questions. And the first one is quite difficult. What's interesting about this question is students will see these types of graphs over and over again. They'll see them on diplomas, like both in bio and chemistry. So it's really good for them to practice these. So we can see that the temperature is decreasing over time. So the question is, well, is this exothermic or endothermic? So it's curricular. Obviously, students need to know the difference between these 2 words, so kind of a definition, but answering a definition question by reading a graph, that's what makes it a skills question. Number 13 is very easy. It's just, I shouldn't say that. What it is it's setting up an equation and using just operation of subtraction to identify the correct answer. So as we go through, back to the slideshow here. So I think it's valuable to consider the different question types students do get on the diploma. And when I kind of went through the 2017 exam, which is the latest one that has been released from Alberta Ed, one of the things I think is important to ask is how many questions contain graphs, how many have tables, and how many use a model or visual data to help the student, or where the students have to look at that and try and then determine the answer. So having gone through the exam, what I discovered was that out of 55 questions, 34 questions had one of these 3 things. Many questions had, just a second here. So what we found is that 8 questions had a graph, 15 questions had a table, and 11 had a model or visual data. So about 70% of the exam has something for the student to read other than just words. So I think it's valuable for us to think about how are we mimicking that, or how are we building those skills to read a graph, to understand what the table's showing, or ways to kind of unpack models or visual data in our classrooms for our students to be successful. One thing I do want to spend a minute just to kind of talk about what we're doing well. In general, students do really well in our knowledge-based questions. Like, we do the work. We're giving the kids content, and they're going home and they're studying it and they're remembering, which is great. Biodiversity and space exploration tend to be really good for us. Biodiversity, this is something that they've seen a lot. They work on some of these biology concepts in elementary and in grade 7 and 8, and then it's just really like consolidated in grade 9. Space exploration, just based on its uniqueness, students really kind of engage in it and tend to do really well. When there's questions that require students to identify something, our kids do really well. Where we do see sort of a room for growth is questions that have a lab component or a lab-based component to it. They have to interpret events or interpret data, predict an effect, or extrapolate information. Our students really struggle. And it is because it's a difficult skill, and it's a skill that kind of requires working on throughout. And so, so I wonder if there are sort of ways that we can kind of try and embed some of that practice throughout the remaining few months. 2 months, I should say, not few. So, strategies to support our kids. I think more testing, I don't think will help students, but maybe engaging in formative activities for each unit that scaffold some of those skills to help increase confidence could help. So, what do I mean by skill building? Sort of what I kind of am getting at is thinking about taking some of those data points or the graphs, the tables, some of those models, and unpacking them together as a class. Using it to start your class. Like, what do we see here? What is the line doing? What would it look like to find a value along the line? How can we predict what happens? It takes just a couple of minutes at the beginning of class to just sort of have the students kind of get used to looking at those other pieces of information that we'll find on the PAT. So when we think about the progression of skills, we want to move the students along from just recognizing and identifying and helping them get better at explaining and interpreting, calculating, and predicting. And what does that look like in a classroom? It can look like a formative activity that starts at the beginning or at the end. We don't just have to give our kids multiple choice and numeric response questions. We can certainly ask our kids to respond to something using short answer to help build some of these skills of explaining and analyzing and comparing. And sometimes we do that in the labs, but we don't always get a chance to get into the lab. So working in pairs or working in small groups to answer questions that require students to interpret or explain might really help build those skills so that they're ready for the PAT. So I really like this chart. One of the powerful things about this chart is it's actually good for us as teachers in my mind. What it helps us do is just ask good questions. So you can see here in the red, these are those simple knowledge questions. Identify, describe, so like, what is a metal? Where are the nonmetals found if we're looking at the periodic table? These yellow kind of types of questions, they're the skills ones. The apply, the interpret, they tend to be our more simpler ones. So if you look here, I kind of imagine this chart like a multiplication table. So why can acid increase? Well, actually, that's a pretty tough question. Never mind. Like, how do metals bind with nonmetals? So these are those kinds of questions. But the best kinds of questions are here, these ones in green. So, why might something happen? Why should something happen? How how will this impact that kind of thing. So here, I've got some questions here on my next slide, but for you as a teacher, this might be a great way to start a lesson or to engage in a formative activity that students might work on together, to help them develop some of those thinking skills that will help support their success on the PAT. Are they going to ask those tough questions, the why would or how might on the PAT? Probably not. But if students are practicing using those thinking skills, they'll just be more adept at answering the multiple choice questions that they're faced with. So some sample questions we could use to to build some good questions. So like, in red, those simpler knowledge questions. What are the three symbiotic relationships? Students probably will be able to answer that fairly well. What is a resistor? Could they identify a resistor on a schematic diagram? What color is phenolphthalein in basic solution? The interesting thing about that is they don't even need to know that. If they needed it, it would probably be given to them. A more, an increase in sophistication would be a more sophisticated question. So something that we might find in the yellow part of that table. How does an indicator help determine the pH of a solution? So kids have to think about, okay, so the pH of a solution can change. An indicator will help me see that because there's a color change, right? Why are lithium and sodium in the same group on the periodic table? So this is a really good question. Students will be able to see that on the periodic table. They're on top, lithium's on top of sodium. Why is that? And so hopefully that they can start to identify, well, they have similarities in their chemical properties, right? So I know this is supposed to look green, but it's kind of dark. How might a chemical reaction be sped up? So now this kind of ties into that chemistry piece of catalysts, like how can we increase chemical reactions? Can we increase the temperature? How does a catalyst work? Could they identify that a catalyst has been added to a reaction? And then a really good question, why should artificial satellites be launched into orbit? Kids might know this. It's a good, I think it's a good warm-up activity, but it does help move kids along and have them work through some of these, more sophisticated questions. Okay, so Brad, I said I'd come back to this, and so here I am. So what I'll do is maybe I'll just walk through it so that we can see how it works. So I'm going to log in, and this is my login. So you should have your login set up by your admin. So I'm going to log in as a staff member. Now, what I wanted to sort of clarify here is your groupings. All of these, this backend stuff should be done by your admin. So you look here, I've got a classroom assessment. So this is what I was talking about. This might be a good opportunity for your students to practice. So you could get this set up, and then I've created my grouping. And so here's select my class. And you can see here now, oops. So once I'm in here, here's my active assessments, and so I can start or schedule an assessment session. So when I click into my classroom groupings, I have the opportunity to click onto a practiced exam or some released items. And so now these are the ones that we see that are on the Alberta Ed website. And so this is a good opportunity for students to practice the 2017 exam, which I showed you examples of, but in the Veretta environment so that they can play with the tools, figure out how to click the buttons, open the periodic table on the side, that kind of thing. So let's find science. Oh, I want to do science. So just to clarify, with classroom assessments, you cannot add your own assessment that you have written as a teacher. Those are the assessments that exist on the Alberta website, and they're those released items. For grade 9, you can also request a field test, and that's a separate subheading that you can see here. I've created a grouping. Obviously, I have no students, but here when you click under active assessments, you can now click field test. What's great about this is you can find some field tests to do. So here's the biological diversity one, matter and chemical change, environmental chemistry, etc., and they're only 30 minutes. You do need to do them on the Chromebook. This is a good opportunity for students to kind of just practice again and be exposed to some good questions. I'd caution you, sometimes the field tests can be kind of hard, so be mindful of how you might want to use that data. Okay, so, okay, cancel, all right. Okay, so additional resources, how to you can analyze your own PAT scores from last year. The question chart that we talked about that looks like a multiplication chart is here if you want to print it. To help your graphing kind of skill development, I love this site. It's called Data Nuggets. It's really good. I'm just going to pop in and show you what it looks like. What I really like about it is it's scaffolded. So it has content levels 1 through 4 from elementary all the way to advanced high school. And then they have graph types. So they scaffold the amount of scaffolding, they scaffold how much information they give the students. So type A is the data is displayed on a graph. So students just have to look at it and do some interpretation. All the way to type C, where student has to graph all of the data. So I'll show you what that kind of looks like. So you can see here, this is just in a searchable table. And so this is content level 1, which might be a good place to start. So if you remember, content level 1 was sort of elementary and junior high. So when I click on it, you can see here's the teacher guide, it's all free. Here's the student activity. This is the graph type A, B, and C. So let's click on C here. It gives students like an article to read, and then what you can see here, it gives them a series of things to work through. Here's some data, which is what I love. All of them ask about variables, and then they give them a plot on which they can also create their own graph. Students would be expected to get a title, give a title, do the axes, and then they would interpret the data. I really like this. It's a great way to sort of get the students thinking about it. It's all really clean. It's just literally all you have to do is print it. This is a great activity in my mind, and the data is really good, and I find it really engaging. Sometimes the articles can be wordy, so maybe that's something you can work through as a class and then have them work on the data part on their own or in small groups. But there's lots on the website. I do urge you guys to take a look and see what you think. All right. And then, yeah, just more about ed information. They do have stuff about the PAT, the exam, etc., and then more information on Veretta. And that is all. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.